Hi, this is Paul. I haven't done much with Jordan Peterson lately. Hasn't been a lot of new material, and some of the material that he's put out isn't of that much interest to me. I'm not as interested in the political as I am in the symbolic, religious, let's say. But two new videos came out. One where he spoke with a couple of scholars. Now, James Orr, if you search for James Orr and you look for the 19th century fundamentalist theologian, who's a pretty big name and pretty important. You got another James Orr who's teaching at a divinity school, but not the same James Orr, a good century later, and then another professor, and sort of with a tantalizing, teasing, searching for God within Harvard and Cambridge. I listened to that video and it was interesting, and I almost did some commentary on it, especially the second half of the video, but it didn't really compel me. The more interesting video I thought was the Telegraph conversation with Peterson. So let's talk about this one a little bit. The first one, the searching for God within Cambridge and Oxford, it sounds like from the Telegraph video that Peterson will be actually get a chance to head there, and it sounds like he's going to start traveling again November, December, maybe do some lectures January. That sounds like that's the plan. So if his health holds, could be interesting. Will it be interesting? I'm not sure, but could be interesting. Now, the date, I'm really appreciative that they're putting some of the dates on these interviews, because those dates are very helpful in terms of sort of getting a sense of Peterson. And the date on that Oxford-Cambridge interview was June 2, which was only a few days after the conversation with John Vervaeke, which was so insane. And you could very much again see the Oxford Cambridge interview with Peterson. He's not at his best. He's obviously more subdued in that, and I'm not going to go back into that whole conversation. He sort of takes over the interview in the second half, and there was some good stuff in there. You could see glimpses of the old Peterson, but he seemed diminished. And again, that has to be because of the health stuff. And I frankly found some of it sort of sad in the way that you'll talk to someone who's getting up there in years, and you can still see glimmers of their, let's say, you see glimmers of where they were at their peak, but it's clearly diminished. There's an interesting section early on in terms of identity and authenticity. Part of, and this is something you always have with Peterson, and this comes through in the Telegraph interview, where I am going to do some playing of that and get into that a little bit. He's very self-consciously sticks to the psychological. That's where he wants to be. And so when he starts getting into questions of authenticity, his categories of authenticity are going to tend to be psychological and not metaphysic and not theological. So that's part of the discussion between the theologians and Peterson in that section. I thought a nice little section on identity, where the theologians rightly said, Augustine wouldn't have any idea what you're talking about. And that sort of gets into some of my thinking around the ContraPoints video that I just released today. I know some of you get into the whole gender pronouns. Of course, this is where Jordan Peterson. Why do you keep calling her she? Why do you keep? Well, that's the identity. That's the persona. That's the face to the public, and the disconnect between, part of me understanding the disconnect between the story of this person from birth, from youth, the transformation, the addition of a persona, understanding that in Barfieldian terms as a loss of participation, and then understanding the development of this persona. I mean, the treating envy. I think about that at all the different levels, and I'm just in awe. But the hunger and the desire for final participation, for the final merger. It's really the merger of heaven and earth. It's the resurrection. It's all of those things, and that That was the video I put out on ContraPoints. So authenticity, identity, those were some interesting little snippets from the first part of the conversation. The second part of the conversation I thought was quite good, and I thought about doing a commentary on it. Still might, but there's so much content coming my way, and I'm so ADHD that I often just move on. But just looking at this other video, and I'm always suspicious because of what I put out on my channel and what I've watched, YouTube always dishes up for me new Jordan Peterson content into the feed. But whenever I see one, especially with a media outlet, I'm a little suspicious that this is old material, that it's a retread. But no, this seems very much to have been a very recent interview. And with the press, I think probably did some vetting to make sure that the interview was going to be a friendly interview, which it was. And I thought it was a good interview. And Peterson comments that he's up north by the lake. I don't know exactly what that means, and I don't need to know. But what's clear is that he's out of the city, and he's much stronger. He's much clearer. He seems quite a bit healthier, and he's closer to his old self. And all of this is really good to see. Now, then they get into the section, are you a prophet? Which is, we're going to have to talk about even that question, because what on earth does someone mean by that? What on earth does someone mean by that in this frame? Well, what do I mean by in this frame? Here you have a secular reporter. He's not talking to me. If I were to ask Jordan Peterson if he were a prophet, that would mean something totally different. What does it mean for a secular reporter to call him a prophet? What is a prophet in the popular imaginary? And what that, to me, sort of boils down to, and even in a Canadian context rather than an American context, because, again, Canadians are more secular. You know, Canada is sort of halfway between the U.S. and the U.K. in some ways, even though they're America's hat. I don't mean any disrespect. It's just something that's sometimes said. But what is it? What on earth do you mean by a prophet? You're a secular journalist, and you have to look at that in sort of a phenomenological way, because the self is buffered. Do you really see? This is part of some of the duplicity in our secular culture, is that we retain some of the genetic material of our past, and there's sort of a longing and a terror and a desire for God to break through. Would that you would part the skies, the Old Testament says. Would that you would part the skies and come down, Lord. Are you a prophet? Are you someone who is going to start something new religiously? And really nothing Jordan said in this conversation surprised me, but I thought he was, part of what I've been hoping for in the second wave has been, okay, he's been in the underworld. What have you learned? Are you more sure of yourself? Are you more solid? And I think we're starting to hear some of that in this interview. I liked his answers.
Your life is one roller coaster of pure surreal events, I think, to be fair.
It's for that would also exacerbated my illness to some degree, because I literally could not believe the things that were happening to me. They're so absurd, they're so over the top that it's jaw-dropping. And in both directions, right? Terrible things and absolutely wonderful things. The whole expanse.
Sure. And just getting back onto this issue of you sort of almost being a prophet in a way. Do you view yourself as that? I mean, as religion declines...
I misspoke. They're not Canadian. He's from the UK. So that makes even the difference between the new world and the old world, that makes the resonance of this even more interesting. More of a deeply secular society. And there's a little bit of a... I think it's a friendly interview, so I don't think any mockery is intended. But in a deeply secular frame, to self-consciously embrace the mantle of a prophet would be mockable. So, yeah, why was I thinking he's Canadian?
You go on this world tour, millions of people read your books, billions of people probably watching the videos online. Do you see yourself as a sort of new religious phenomenon for people?
And of course, you would have to ask the interviewer, what do you mean by religious? Because the secular frame sort of wants to know and segment and push the religious over to the side. So I think that would have been a fair question to ask back. What do you mean by religious?
Not new. Not new. And
online, do you see yourself as a sort of new religious phenomenon for people?
not new. Not new. And I see myself as fortunate. That's how I see myself, that I have the opportunity to do this.
But are you a prophet?
And,
at the same time, if you want to do a good interview with Jordan Peterson, it's a good question to ask him, because of course, a la the colleague who brought him into the department and was horrified at his rise and wrote that piece in the Toronto Star and showed us that Jordan had been looking around Toronto for perhaps an unused church building that he could buy on the cheap in order to give lectures. This is, of course, before the Bader Theater and the Biblical Series. And, to buy a little place that would seat 100 or 2 people now would be ridiculous. But this is a testing question.
see, to say yes or no, I have to think about how I might be conceptualized.
Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Come on, what do you think? And I think to what degree is it's absolutely responsible to work on your response based on how it will be heard. That's just good faith communication. But it's interesting.
How what I'm doing might be conceptualized. No, I think I see myself as a psychologist, and fundamentally, I am a psychologist. I'm a behavioral psychologist.
And Galadriel, did you pass the test? And I think it's a good answer. I think it's the right answer. So, but it's just so Jordan Peterson, that moment right there. I'm not saying he's being dishonest at all. I think he's truly wrestling with the question, and he is, as Peugeot said with his conversation with Peugeot, Jordan has 1 foot on both land masses, and they're going apart. And this question is like, well, are those hamstrings hurting, Jordan? The land masses, modernity is moving away. Are you going to continue to stick in modernity and to say, I'm a psychologist? Okay, modernity. And again, because modernity is also, I keep the public frame is for things that can fit into the scientific box. The public frame is not for my metaphysical ideas. And if you listen to the conversation with James Orr and Nigel, I forget the name, the Oxford and Cambridge conversation, similar thing. This is where he sticks. Maybe this is where he's going to stick. But part of the difficulty with all of this is he's sticking to the modernist landmass, and he keeps pointing to the new world, which is the old world. And that's part of the reason why I said new prophet. No, not new. That's for sure. Because what he's doing is continuing to stand on modernity, but pointing to what's coming beyond modernity. And he doesn't mean bloody postmodernism, cultural Marxism. Okay?
I got very interested in psychoanalytic thinking, especially the Jungian variants, and I'm a professor, and I'm doing that, on a much larger stage, let's say. But that's really what I'm doing.
Now, that too is interesting because, again, some people pushed back on this previous times that I've said it. His profession has been denied him. And in that way, he's sort of like Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying. Could he go back to the university? Probably not. There's no way he could just stroll in, at least maybe 5 years from now, but then he's pushing retirement. Could he just stroll back into the university class? Could he continue to work with grad students? Well, maybe. But this finished his career, and you get the sense that, he, before C16, he was quite satisfied with his life. He had, dabbled in politics early on, of course. He had built his career. He had published a ton of stuff. He was happy working with grad students. He was a popular professor who's getting getting reviews from his class. This class has changed my life. And then, of course, C16 and boom. And I feel for him because part of me can understand this, because it would be as if something I say on something my channel would blow up and suddenly I would have 1 million subscribers. I don't think that's a good thing because I've got my church, I've got my family, I've got my meetup, I've got Estuary, I've got all these things, and God bless small things. My channel is a nice size. It's sometimes more than I can handle, even the size it is. I don't really need it to. It needs to. The numbers, the subscribers probably keep needing to just inch up slowly because fresh people in the mix are almost always a good thing. And people do watch. I become map territory for people and they drop out. That's all just completely normal and in many ways as it should be. But if something would happen to me and I could no longer be a local minister, if I could no longer preach on Sunday, if I could no longer relate to the people here at Living Stones like I can relate to them, Coffee Break has started up in person again. I get to see the ladies. They give me their treats. I give them my hugs. Now, all these women are my mother's age, if not older. So I'm the pastor of a small local church. That's a beautiful thing. To have that ripped from me because of celebrity or popularity or controversy, that's a painful thing. So now I'm a psychologist, but he can't have a practice anymore. And he can't teach in the classroom anymore. And he can't have grad students anymore. So now, and he's doing it on a bigger stage, but is it the same thing? Because fame, popularity, can you really connect with people? And the answers that come through this are one-on-one. This is what I want to connect with people and to have this go.
And so it's a combination of those two things. And I speak about religious matters, but I don't see myself as a religious leader. I don't want to make that, although I speak about those things.
Are you worried?
And it's interesting because you very much get the sense that things have settled down in a sense because of his illness. The feeding frenzy is not around him like it was. Now, if he would go on Fox News or MSNBC or do New York Times interviews or things like that, some of that feeding frenzy would come up. But it's not 2016 anymore. It's not even 2018. The world has changed and moved on. I was amazed that when we restarted now the rebranded Estuary, not the Sacramento Jordan Peterson meetup, how many people came and the first thing out of their mouths was Jordan Peterson. That was very interesting to me. But things are settling down now. He's been ill. Now he's getting time to say, okay, who am I? What am I about? What is the rest of my life going to be about? Am I going to keep selling books? Don't know how don't really know how well this book has done. Certainly not as well as the first one. I'm going to do a biblical series. I'm going to talk to people on my channel. This is my new life. And so he's a year older than I am, so he's 59. And he's looking at, okay, what is the next 5-6 years? If I regain my strength, if I regain my health. So he's at a point now where he's reassessing. Okay, what's my life going to look like now after this storm that destroyed the life that I had put together before?
Worried that could happen?
Those things.
Are you worried that could happen? That you could become a kind of a sort of pseudo-religious figure to people?
Now again, okay, so I correct myself, the UK. What on earth do you mean by that? And again, I go back to...
I wanted to start maybe with Tara's point about sort of the durability of this kind of, I'll conflate your 2 points and say the durability of imminent individualist religion in American life, right? And the fact that you have plenty of, divination and God within spirituality going back to the 18th century.
So when this interviewer asks if he's a prophet, if he's a new religious figure, it's sort of in the Strange Rites, Tara Isabel Burton realm of this is new religion. It's religion on YouTube. He's a guru and people are going to, he's got a mass following and people are going to hang on his every word because he's the light bringer. There's another word for that. He's the light bringer. He's the one that owns the libs and exposes the corruption and saves Western civilization. And so,
It seems to me that if you look at sort of the historical pattern in American life, you have sort of either surges of that kind of spirituality or particular religious geniuses who manifest it. And then
is he a religious genius that manifests it? Now, I would think he sees himself in the line of Iliada and Jung and Hero of a Thousand Faces. That's who he's going to name a little later in the video.
Movements and institutions that they build have historically then been sort of pulled back towards a kind of normative Christian structure or framework, to use Steve's account, right? So, to take the examples of the 2 biggest 19th century examples maybe are Christian Science, which comes out of New Thought in certain ways, and Mormonism, which gets its start in the sort of the kind of divination happy world of upstate New York in the early 19th century. And both of those, if you look at them from a sort of, how Christian are they perspective at the outset, you can...
Which is exactly what I've done, what these Roman Catholic scholars have done in their new book out on Jordan Peterson. How Christian is he? That's exactly the questions being asked of him.
And make a case that they're both pretty stark departures, maybe not getting all the way to something we call paganism or post-Christianity, but clearly really stark departures. In Mormonism's case, you mentioned polyamory, right, as a feature of the contemporary political landscape. Early Mormonism goes all the way to polygamy. And then, over the course of the next 100 years, you get to a point where by the time of the 1950s and 1960s, both Christian Science and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, while they're still regarded as heretical or dangerous or cultic by some other Christian denominations, are, I think, reasonably seen as connected to a kind of, a kind of Christian tradition in American life. And there's clearly an aspiration, at least among parts of the leadership of those what become those churches, to move in that direction. And it seems to me one thing that's been different since the 60s and 70s, right, is that hasn't happened to the same degree, right? So we've gone through the sort of Marianne Williamson presidential campaign, which unfortunately has not won enough support to merit the fascination that I've applied to it. But I feel like a 19th century version of Marianne Williamson would have started a church, right? And would have, and over the course of 50 years, there would be a sort of Williamsonian denomination that had some sort of ambiguous relationship to the Protestant center in American life. And, Williamson has some kind of institution now, but it's very clear that she doesn't regard herself as in that light. And the same goes for, figures ranging from Deepak Chopra to Oprah Winfrey and so on. And so I'm curious what you think.
And this sort of brings into the megachurch. Now, Peterson hasn't started an institution, and he's going to say that in a minute, but
spending time in these religious worlds, what happens when that doesn't happen, right? Like, what happens to this kind of spiritual energy if there isn't one, institution building, or two, a sort of pull back towards a kind of, quasi-normative Christian framework? Does it just continue? Are we in just a sort of endless cycle, right, where astrology was big when my parents were young, and when I was growing up, I knew what my parents' sign was, and then by the time I got to college in the 1990s, nobody talked about astrology anymore, but now it's back. Like, do we just run a cycle, or what do you think happens?
So I think I would motion that, you mentioned Oprah, and I think of Gwyneth Paltrow, that the lifestyle brand may have perhaps in some senses replaced the church as the kind of institutionalization of a certain kind of spiritual trend, which is to say, sure, Oprah doesn't have a church exactly, but at the same time, there is a degree in which sort of with enough money, with enough of a following, the sort of grassroots fringe traditions do become, like astrology, like psychics, which are now at Goop Summits, do become codified in some way.
Are you worried that could happen? That you could become a kind of a sort of pseudo-religious figure to people?
Well, this has been going on for quite a while, and I don't think it has happened, and so no, I don't think it'll happen, and I think there's.
I'm less. I'm. Hasn't it though, to a degree?
Ways of mitigating that, if with careful attention and careful speech. It's. And I don't want it, which is also something, because if I wanted it, then, that unconscious desire or conscious desire even would shape the way that I speak. But I don't want that. And I'm trying to point to things that are clearly beyond me. They're clear, and I know they're beyond me, and that's what I want. And I want, the thing, I think part of what protects me against that, I suppose, is that I'm not trying to produce followers. I am actually trying to help people discover what it is, their relationship with that part of them that awe calls out. And I believe that exists in everyone. I really do believe that. And so.
But locating the part that calls in oneself instead of from above doesn't mean that you yourself won't be that religious figure. And this is where, again, going back to the Oxford and Cambridge conversation, ostensibly about God, which the conversation wasn't a lot about, and where Peterson locates, in that sense, see, part of this also is the weird Jungian definitions of self and God. Those don't really map onto most of the assumptions that are out there in the English language world, at least UK, US, Canada, Australia, to a degree, Germany and the Netherlands. those mappings are much more Christian than the sort of definition of God in Jung, the definition of self in Jung. He's answering carefully, but I'm not so sure he's right.
And so in that sense, I'm on equal footing with everyone that I'm talking to. And I do believe that if they brought that out into the world, they can bring that out into the world. And if they did, that would be immensely beneficial for everyone. And so it's not that easy to produce a cult of individuals. And so I think the fact that my focus is the individual is the best protection against that. I'm not asking for people to follow, partly because they need to figure out where to go for themselves. They really need.
Now, yes, but the self-authoring program, the Big Five personality profile, the podcast, the books, all of the, I mean, this is self-help. I mean, I'm pretty sure somewhere in the bookstore, that's exactly where this book would be located as self-help. So maybe not religion S, but certainly religion W.
Need that, and I don't know where each person should go because each person is different, importantly different. So no, I don't think that that's, if that was a real danger, I think it would have already happened. It's quite a while now. I mean, this has been going on for 5 years, and it does in some sense continue to get bigger, I think. It's not that easy to see, especially during COVID, but I don't think that that's going to happen.
You mentioned COVID there, and I think it's a really interesting topic to move on to. Were you surprised?
Okay, we'll probably just skip the COVID stuff. If you're curious about what he has to say about COVID, just watch the whole interview. So he's getting asked questions about lockdowns, vaccine passports, government responses to COVID. Peterson will give the answers that if you watch enough Jordan Peterson, you understand the kinds of answers he'll give. But then he takes the question this way.
You've got other Democrats, well, he's a Republican, but Democrats comparing Trump supporters to terrorists and calling for a second domestic war on terror. Are you concerned about this rhetoric of describing your political foes
very
as
very
Taliban?
Concerned about it. Well, part of the argument that I want to outline in my new book, and I'm going to talk about this at Cambridge and Oxford because I'm also going to Oxford at the end of November. So how much fun is that? I can't believe I have those two invitations. It's so wonderful. My daughter is also going to speak at Oxford. We're going to speak on the same day. So that's...
Now, notice, new book, and this is the subject that he's been talking about quite a bit, which probably means he's writing his book, and it's on his mind a lot, about the transposition of the religion and the political. And again, I'm really happy about this. I'm a fan, I'm a supporter, but I'm not, when he answers like he does these questions about whether or not he's religious, I'm not so sure. Gosh, how do I want to say this? I'm not so sure the full impact and import of what's going on. It's a little bit of a dodge. And some of my friends out there will know I dodge questions too. And maybe that's wise. But, I completely agree that with the religious displaced, the political grows outside. And in terms of the conversations and the attention that I'm giving to the progression of progressive Christianity out of the category of Christianity, it very much is a secularized and a secularizing movement where the church as organism is unnecessary and displaced, and in that sense, the state. So again, in the Protestant world, those of you who have been following my videos, riffing off Charles Taylor, in the Protestant Charles Taylor complains that in the pre-Protestant Reformation, you had two-speed religion in Catholicism. You had the monastery, who were the athletes, and then the regular folks in the church, and you had Christendom. So in some ways, three speeds. And then he says, well, Protestantism is sort of a one speed because you want a holy city. You want, in a sense, to manifest the vision of Jeremiah in the city of Zurich or the city of Geneva or the city of New Haven or Plymouth or America. And that very much, takes part in the United States. And when it comes to the Civil War, just listen to the battle hymn of the Republic. This is God's truth is marching on. The American government, all of this stuff gets mixed through. And so then you come to during the Cold War, where church attendance reaches its peak in American history, but there is moral alignment. And so once again, you sort of have a two-speed religion where church people and church Christians are the athletes. They sort of stand in for the monasteries, and then the government and the state is sort of the second speed. And then, of course, the counterculture and the 1960s comes through and just sort of deeply asks questions in that. And the article that I've read a number of times, how white members of the mainline, this causes a crisis among white mainline Protestants. And what happens is there's sort of an inversion, and the state itself takes on the global role or the primary role. And in that way, somebody was asking in the comments about Jesus and John Wayne. In some ways, in the American story, you see this at the Civil War, at the victory of the North over the South in the Civil War, and you see this in the progressive era. That's the period following the Civil War, where you have, women's movements and child labor laws and the temperance movement. I mean, the temperance movement is fundamental because you're going to try to take consumption of alcohol out of the culture in order to protect women and children. That is the reason. That is the cause. And it is, to make all of America a safe space. That's what's behind the temperance movement. And in some ways, what you're seeing now in the rise of the woke and the imperial blue church is that it's in a sense the ambition of the victory on the Civil War is that we can finally do this. We can build better. We can build back better. You can have the great reset. Now, after the little tiny crisis of COVID and after the Trumpster has been put away, now we can arrive. And in that way, all those darn masculine Republican voting evangelical Christians out there are a huge impediment to the coming of the kingdom. And so those who still, so then you have the new atheists have always had American evangelical evolution-resistant Christians in their sight. If you don't believe me, listen to Richard Dawkins' appearance on Unbelievable, where Dawkins basically just says it to the Jewish leader and the Christian leader that he is interviewing. He says, it's not you people I have a problem with, it's those. And because America sort of comes into its own now in the 21st century in a way it couldn't in the 19th century. With the victory over the South at the end of the Civil War, the United States was still, this nation in a faraway place, even though Americans believe, just read 19th century religious and political imaginings. We are the vanguard, we are the frontier, we are the people that are going to remake the world. And of course, that comes to full flourishing with Woodrow Wilson, who ironically watched Jefferson Davis, in a sort of post-Civil War triumph, taken away in chains when Woodrow Wilson was a little boy. So Woodrow Wilson, of course, goes to Europe for the Treaty of Versailles, and at this point, he wants America and the progressive era to lead to the birth of the eschaton, as it were. But what Wilson doesn't understand is that his timing is wrong, and this post-millennial eschaton was crushed in the killing fields of France and Belgium in the First World War. And of course, then you have the Roaring Twenties, and you have the Great Depression, and then you have the conclusion of the First World War and the Second World War, and that again brings in the American century. And now then, in a way, In God We Trust goes on the money, and American church attendance reaches its peak, but the main line is in alignment with the values of America, only to be shattered, first trembled by the civil rights movement, which in many ways is Dr. King acting like a prophet, telling Americans, okay, I'm on board with you. Now let's finish the job and make African Americans equal heirs in the eschaton of the kingdom. But he is, of course, assassinated and himself becomes a saint, a martyr. He is now, of course, represented in granite on the Capitol Mall. And the 70s, in some ways, the Joker movie set in the 70s. Now, I remember the 70s in New York, but they had to find a little piece of Newark because Newark and Peterson are not gentrified like Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens. So he finds a little piece of Newark. So there's a long history of this. And are you a prophet, Jordan? Well, where does Jordan fit into that bigger picture?
It's ridiculously improbable. See, I'm interested in what's underneath those problems. I'm really and one of the things that's happening to us is the political has collapsed into the religious. So there's this new...
Now, right there, the political has collapsed into the religious. Little Jordan Peterson, taken to the United Church of Canada. The older he gets, finds it increasingly uncompelling. Gets very interested in politics. Okay, Jordan, you want to keep taking it to the individual, and now you're going to use the platforms of YouTube and you want to continue to do this work, but it's going to be awfully hard to complain about the religious collapsing into the political and it's going to be awfully hard to not become a religious figure yourself unless you are part of a religious institution that is obviously not political. So, listening to him, there's some deep conflicts going on down here below the surface. You're interested below the surface? You're going to have to look at this. Now, I know the comments are going to come. No, Jordan can't join a church because if Jordan joins a church, then he loses the strange evangelistic power that he has in what he's doing. Fair enough. Maybe, but it makes it harder and harder and harder to continue to deny your place. I have to turn down my mic, I see here, because the video levels in some of these are a little lower. It makes it harder, and I'm loud. It makes it harder and harder to keep denying that you're a religious figure when you're acting religiously outside of religious institutions. And it makes it harder and harder to imagine you won't appear in whatever the successor for Tara Isabel Burton's Strange Rights book is 30 years from now, writing about the Jordan Peterson movement between 2016 and 2021.
New Testament statement that Christ makes. It's an unbelievably impactful statement. It's a statement that is in some sense miraculous in its effects. You render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. And you know, the entire formal separation of church and state in the Western world is a consequence of that statement. You just think of that, how impactful that statement was. That's literally the case. I don't care if you're religious or not. It's irrelevant.
I'm not so sure about that. I understand how that is definitely an application for that verse, but the separation of church and state, that has a very specific history too.
Historically, that's the case. That statement did that. So that's a miracle, you know, in some real sense. Well,
remember, this is an answer to a political question after we've been talking about whether or not he's a religious figure.
Let's say that's true psychologically, as far as I'm concerned, as well as politically, is that there's a domain that's sacred and there's a domain that's profane. And that's true psychologically. And if you don't keep those separate, then the sacred contaminates the profane, or alternatively, the profane gets inflated into the sacred, and that's a catastrophe, because then everything becomes emotionally overwrought, because you're no longer a political enemy, you're an emissary of Satan. I mean, that's essentially what happened to me with the Red Skull, you know. It got pushed that far. It was right to the point of ultimate absurdity. It's like, really? Like, Nazi isn't a bad enough epithet? I have to be a magical super Nazi? And really? That's really necessary? Well, what's going on? Well, obviously, because Red Skull, you think of that, Red Skull is Satan for all intents and purposes. It's only a matter of nomenclature. And so it's not like the Marvel universe is Christian, but it is in a profound sense. I mean, all those movies have underlying religious themes, fighting off the demonic extraterrestrial aliens that are invading the earth. It's all played out in the domain of religious ideation. I mean, Thor is a god, for God's sake. It's not like this is hard to see. Well, if the profane becomes inflated with the sacred, then you demonize your enemies. You know, and then maybe you sacralize yourself as well, and that's not so good. You know, you're an environmentalist. It's like, well, are you sure you're not the Messiah? Are you sure that's not what you're doing? You're the savior of the planet. It's like, are you sure that's so good for your ego? And it's not.
So another way to view this is he is basically taking his own advice. Are you a prophet? Long pause. I have to think about how I'm going to answer this because of how it's going to be heard. Long pause. No. Well, why? I'm not trying to be. Why? Because you've got to relieve the religious over there. Okay. Is that what you do? Can you have that be a functional part in society if no one is actually participating in it as a functional part of society? You know, Canada's a far more secular country, as is the UK, than the United States.
It's not. You know, the Earth has to orbit the sun in Jung's terminology, or if it falls into the sun, it's a catastrophe. And all sorts of discussions we're having are becoming inflated with religious concerns. And then, you know, on the materialist atheist side, let's say the scientific side, although it's not really that, there's this insistence that religion is nothing but a set of mistaken scientific propositions about the nature of reality, which it's certainly, that's not a very sophisticated analysis. And I've seen this sort of thing start to happen to people like Richard Dawkins. I mean, he's fallen prey. He's become victim to the collapse of the religious into the political. It's not good. And this has nothing to do with arguments about, you know, do I believe in God or does God exist? It's like, that's not the point of this. That's not the point. That's not.
But it's not completely disconnected. And maybe I am going to do some commentary on that other video, because one of the things that he says when asked about what time is it? How long is this video going to be?
Just wondering, in terms of your encounter with younger people, at what point does religious identification begin to gain traction?
Well, I think there's a variety of answers to that. One is that one pathway in is the diagnosis that the desire for deep meaning and also deep responsibility is there and valid and in everyone, and to be encouraged and recognized. So there's that. And then there's a serious discussion about, I would say, about love and truth and the pragmatic utility of both, and both as expressions of faith. You know, because you can't say, well, there's evidence that love, in the broadest sense, is the most effective manner in which to orient yourself in the world. You could make a counter case that it's power, for example. And you can't prove that speaking the truth is for the best, and partly that's because people get into trouble for speaking the truth all the time. But you can say, you can stake your life on those two things and see what happens. And that there's an adventure in that, and that appeal to adventure, that's really attractive to especially to young men, but to young people in general. And then there's one other element, which is part of it has to be the removal of rational objections. It's like when I did my biblical lecture series, I said I was going to stay psychological about it, except when I had to become metaphysical because of the limitations of my knowledge. And so I was trying to make sense of it. It's like, how can you have a relationship with this book that makes sense, so that you're not crucifying your reason, but using it alongside of you, and so that it's not mere, let's say, superstitious foolishness with regards to your axiomatic presuppositions of the form that the rational atheists criticize so effectively. So I said, well, I brought reverence to Genesis. I said, this book's been around a long time, and there's the possibility that there's something in it that I don't understand that's appealed to people across history, and let's approach it from that perspective and see what we can make of it. And that seems to have proved extremely popular, like sort of unbelievably popular. And so
when you mentioned this desire for a deep desire, in a sense, for a sense of being responsible,
for seriousness
and the truth, both of those connote to me, as it were, something that is given an objective to which we are accountable. And it reminds me of what your compatriot Charles Taylor once wrote in his best, shortest book, I'm glad to say, The Ethics of Authenticity. He said, reflecting on authenticity as being the kind of universal popular value we all recognize, he said, authenticity only makes sense when there's a wider given horizon that gives it significance. So choice only has significance within a context that gives it significance. Otherwise, choice is caprice, it's whimsy, it doesn't matter at all. And so I suppose seeing this through Christian eyes as I do, what we have here is a recognition of the need for, if you like, a given moral order within which we are, we have freedom, and the freedom is what makes us responsible and makes our decisions and choices really heavy with significance. But there is something that is given, and we didn't create it. and a large part.
And right here, you see sort of the theologians coming from above, Peterson coming from below.
Not the only part, a large part of the affirmation of there being one God is that there is not just a physical coherence to created reality, but also a moral coherence. It's not the only meaning.
One God, okay, so a couple...
And they're going to go on from there.
That's not the issue here. The issue is we have a religious instinct. And then the question is why? And then the question is, well, what happens when it's not nourished? Where does it go? What does it do? Well, the rationalist idea is, well, if we get rid of all that superstitious claptrap, we'll just be like straight rationalist materialists and the world will move in a positive direction. It's like, no, wrong. Too simple. That isn't. Where do we get our values? And that's the conversation I'm trying to have with people. That's a big part of it. Is look, science does not provide values. We need values, or nihilism, or reigns. And you want that? No. So
where are we going to get our values? Can you get your values from psychology?
Where do we get our values? And if there are values, are some values higher than others? And if so, what are the highest values? And what are they opposed to? And how do we embody them? These aren't conversations for children. This is serious stuff, and it's underneath all this noise and terror that we see playing out so destructively. So you see what that does to your soul. You're on Twitter. You get tangled up in these political arguments. It just hurts you. It's not good for you. And so I would like to... I'm trying to figure out what's going on underneath that and what we need to do about it.
And that point about, sorry to interrupt, but that point about being on Twitter and sort of getting embroiled in these arguments, we've all done it. We've all got really angry. We've all got really depressed about certain things, I think. And you see many people around you. I've got sort of friends, family members who I'm slightly concerned about because they're getting so radicalized by this stuff. They're getting so angry that they can't remove themselves from the issue. And I was speaking to my friend before this interview, what kind of questions should I be asking you? And we had this debate, and it was this. When you're on Twitter and you're angry about these issues, or even if you're not on Twitter and you're angry about wokeism, for example, or identity politics, what do you do? So we came up with two solutions, and I want you to comment on both. I said, well, look, the thing that helps me is to switch off. I just turn off all my devices, I go for a run, I go for a walk, I go on holiday and don't think about these things, and I feel so much happier, and I come back refreshed, and unfortunately I have to think about these things for my job, but if I didn't, I probably wouldn't think about them as much as I had to. My friend said, no, it's our duty to fight this stuff. It's our duty to try and change the way that society is heading. It's our duty to try and get involved in this debate and get involved in this argument. So what is the solution? What should we do? Who's right?
No, I think you're both right. You have to see how much you can take and not take any more than that. And so shutting off and protecting yourself against the electronic onslaught, let's say, which is all new technology, right? We have no idea what its psychological impact is, and especially of something like Twitter, because Twitter is a radically new form of communication. And we don't know what it is. We have no idea. Like, does the fact that you radically increase, possibly, and we don't understand that. And by the time we do, well, time to understand and get adapted to Twitter before no one can keep up. And so unplugging, that's really necessary. And it's very hard for any of us to figure out, well, how much can you take? I'm up in this northern, get up here, lake now, and I didn't know if I would ever get up here. We bought this place in February, and I was so sick I didn't think I'd ever get to see it. And I came up here about a month ago when I started feeling better, and I haven't left. I thought, oh, looks like I live here. Who would have expected that? But it's really nice to be out of the city, way better than I thought. I needed it way more than I knew. And it's part of this connectedness, right? It's great, it's wonderful, but man, it comes at a price. And
so that's the first question. And I agree with both of his answers, but this is connected to the religious question, because one of the things that... Okay, I'm a pastor. I'm going to give pastoral advice. One of the things that a robust, acted upon, committed, religious commitment affords is both of these. But the answer of escape and distraction, that is a tactical answer, but what you really need is a worldview answer where all of this politics, everything that's happening in the secular is surrounded by what's happening on the bigger stage, in the heavenlies, with God in heaven, etc., etc. And I think that's actually a better answer, because he's going to say, well, actually, the other answer is you do have to be involved. But then the question, how do you be involved and not let it slip in, is you actually need to practice your religion. In the words of Jonathan Peugeot, you need to go to church. And, all hat tip to Andrew Klavan, church should not be about politics. Obviously, your politics should be informed by your church. That's what it means to be in a democracy and a citizen. But church should not be about politics, because your church is about that which is eternal, that which is higher, that which is more, that which is forever. Politics is now, religion is always. And unless you have that situated, and unless you practice that in your life, you're going to struggle with it. Well, you're always going to struggle with it, but let him finish the answer.
And with regard to responsibility, well, your friend is right. It's like you have a religious responsibility. You have a political responsibility. You have a communal responsibility, and you need to shoulder those responsibilities for a variety of reasons. Partly because none of those systems will work without you, and you won't work without them. And so you ignore them at your peril. Truly, you ignore them at your peril. Partly because you won't be what you could be without shouldering that communal responsibility. And then you'll pay for that in your individual life, because you'll be shallow and immature and weak and clueless and a puppet and a sheep and all of that. And so, and it's not a simple matter to get that balance right. I mean,
it's not a simple.
But see, and that's a good answer too. But he's not saying, which he should say, how do you not have the political slip in and swell and overwhelm the religious when there is a religious vacuum? That is what we are dealing with. We are dealing with the religious vacuum because, well, let's quote Jesus again. You sweep that house out, you clean that room, and 7 more demons worse than the first are going to come in. And so, okay, Jordan has his cabin. He's going to do the escape, and he's feeling stronger so that he can do an interview like this. But you've got to fill the religious space. If you don't, your politics will continue to expand.
Because, and one of the things that I think is a danger for people when they take on that responsibility and they see these issues and they want to solve them, for example, which may start with trying to solve the problems in your own life, is it's difficult to know where to stop and where, and how do I word this correctly?
Well, that was pretty good.
They need to. Well, I think that what I'm trying to say is people can become radicalized, and people can become. You can go too far down the rabbit hole, and you can become entrenched in these issues. Do you see what I mean?
That's part of the danger. That's part of the danger of the contamination of the profane with the sacred. It's exactly that, because you see, there's an instinct that pulls you into that, say, conspiratorial and radical and overcommitted form of thinking. What you're doing is manifesting religious devotion to a set of ideas, let's say.
And so how do you not do that? You need to have religious devotion in your life. You're going to have it.
Don't warrant that worship. And worship, what is worship? Worship is what you imitate. That's what it is. To worship something is to imitate it. That's what it means, most fundamentally. Well, be careful what you worship. Be careful. And you think, well, I don't have to worship anything. It's like, oh, that's what you think, is it? Well, don't be so sure that all those people who lived before us who insisted that you did have to worship something and that you should be very careful about what it was, don't be so bloody sure they were stupider than you. And so you see, so many people, well, lots of people, for example, are radical about their atheism. And somebody wrote me the other day and said, oh, no, it was a YouTube comment, said, I was one of those radical atheists. This is what the guy said. But I was like brutalized by fundamentalist religious people when I was growing up. And lots of atheistic people are like that. And I wrote back briefly and said, yes, point taken. I understand that the excesses of a certain kind of religious ideation have produced this counter-reaction, this emotional counter-reaction. But that's religious fervor. So let's say that we're prone to religious fervor because we need to be committed to what is important. Well, then we need to figure out where that instinct should be oriented. And this is why I'm so interested in the idea of the logos, because that is the Western world's attempt to answer that question. What is this logos? Well, it's the root word of logic, so rationality is embedded in it. It's a very important part of that. It's also that element of consciousness that interacts with the ground of being to produce phenomena, to produce experience, the world of experience. It's a world engendering force. It's an ethical demand as well. So you see that in your wrestling with your conscience, which is a virtually universal experience. Like, what the hell is that exactly, wrestling with your conscience? Why can't you just tell yourself what to do and you listen?
And these are all the themes we've heard in the second wave. He's clearly working on a book, and these are the themes that are coming through.
Well, you're not like that. Something in you resists. Well, what is that thing that resists, and what's it related to? That's the Jungian self, by the way, technically speaking. It's the totality of what you could be, manifesting itself in objection to your narrow-minded, rational fervor, let's say, something like that, or it's something like that. But so you want to be religious about the right things, and that's partly, again, why my emphasis is on the individual. I've struggled in some sense with committing to the spiritual or the political my whole life. It's always because I was interested in politics since I was like 5, like really, really young. And I always considered a political career. And many people have asked me, I don't think I have the emotional stability for it, frankly speaking. I don't think I could tolerate the stress. But in any case, every time I've had a choice, I pick the psychological. It's what I would like to. I've devoted my life to. What would you say? Well, psychologists work on individuals, and that's what I decided to do. And that's the. It's safer in some sense to do that as well, right? It's who doesn't. Wouldn't it be better for everyone if there were more better people? How could that be worse?
We're getting to the 2024 election. Well, we're not, but in America, they start to the 2024 election. Well, we're not, but in America, they start election campaigning very, very quickly and very, very soon, unfortunately. And people were talking about Donald Trump running again. Would you be concerned about that? Do you think that could cause, and not just because of the man himself, but also the kind of reaction from his enemies? I mean, we saw from 2016 to 2021, the media were hugely hyperactive, and I think we saw a lot of division and we saw a lot of polarization. So, are you concerned we could see a repeat of that if he runs again?
Another political question.
It would surprise me if he doesn't run again. I think it'll happen. I wouldn't claim to be a particularly astute political seer. I've made many mistakes in political prediction in my life, and it isn't obvious to me what should happen. It wouldn't surprise me if Trump ran again. And yes, there will be an exacerbation of these differences because there's an underlying problem, and the problem, I think, is the one that we've been discussing. And unless we get that straightened out, which is very difficult, it's a very hard, very, very challenging thing to do, because in some sense we have to become more conscious of what was once religious and unconscious. We have to start to understand it explicitly, and that's unbelievably difficult. I mean, I learned a lot of what I learned about the psychology of religion by reading Carl Jung and some of his students, Erich Neumann in particular, who's extraordinarily brilliant psychologist.
Now, I know a lot of people will say, well, but in America, it's the religious people who are being political. And there's certainly religious people who are being political. But overall, and again, if you look at One Faith No Longer by George Yancey, even though the conservative religious people are the ones who always catch the airtime, for the most part, it's actually the progressives that their politics becomes their religion. Based on this research, we highlight here that progressive Christians emphasize political values relating to social justice issues as they determine who is part of their in-group. They tend to be less concerned about the theological agreement. Conservative Christians, however, do not put strong emphasis on political agreement in order to determine if you are one of them. Their major concern is whether you agree with them on core theological points. The bottom line we need to illuminate in this book is that progressive and conservative Christians use entirely different factors in determining their social identity and moral values. Indeed, we argue that the ways in which these two groups deal with the questions of meaning are so different that it is time to regard them as distinct religious groups rather than subgroups under a single religious umbrella. While there are many ways to look at the divisions within Christianity, racial, political, theological, denominational, etc., we will start with a theological divide to explore other implications of the splits between Christians. Our aim is to show how theologically progressive and conservative Christians define their social and political priorities and how these definitions differ from each other. Quite often we see news coverage about conservative Christians, but while some news outlets publish stories about progressive Christianity, these stories largely do not help one achieve a deeper understanding about the nature of progressive Christianity and where the root differences lie between it and conservative Christians. While occasionally we hear about resistance to politically conservative Christians, generally our understanding about the nature of progressive Christians is lacking. There's also been relatively little scholarship that examines the nature of progressive Christianity. There has been work outlining the history of progressive Christians, as well as primary documents by progressive Christians that enunciate their stated beliefs. Recent attempts to explore progressive religious groups have utilized the case study approach in interviews with congregants of a progressive church. This work is valuable but not generalizable. Stenger does use a national survey to argue that potential members of liberal Christian groups may be more than indicated by the size of these groups. Her work provides some insights into why progressive Christians are less effective in their political activism than conservatives. In other words, you sort of have an irony that the conservative Christians are actually more effective in their politics, even though for a majority of conservative Christians, in terms of how these values work in themselves, the politics is not central to their goal. In other words, the religious strength of the group is strong enough to resist having everything be oriented by the politics. In other words, the religion is vital enough to keep the politics from encroaching. Part of what he goes into is in-groups and out-groups. Conservative Christians tend to reject Muslims and atheists as part of an out-group, but they do not necessarily reject political liberals. This evidence suggests that progressive Christians tend to use political values to establish their social identity, while conservative Christians tend to use theological values to accomplish that task.
Eric Neumann in particular, who's an extraordinarily brilliant psychologist. It's very, very difficult intellectually. I mean, there's a lot of psychologists have contempt for Jung. They think of him as a mystic. And my experience has been, I've never, ever met someone who understood Jung, who criticized him that way. Every single person I've ever met who had that attitude had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. And I think a big part of that is his books they're very difficult. And making this stuff conscious, understanding it explicitly. I mean, even with my book Maps of Meaning, there's been 4 variants of that book written by 4 different people. I wrote one. Eric Neumann wrote The Origins and History of Consciousness. It's the same book. Jung wrote Symbols of Transformation. That's the same book. Joseph Campbell wrote The Hero with 1,000 Faces. That's the same book. And to explain what's in that book, in some sense, that took me like 100 hours of lecturing, and I never got to the bottom of it. So we have the daunting task before us is to understand the source of our values explicitly, and then to have an intelligent, broad-scale, intense public discussion about the ranking of those values. What's at the top? What's at the bottom? And this is, and people are captivated by that discussion. That's partly why they're watching my lectures. And so we have to sort that out, because otherwise it'll just manifest itself in this ideological fractionalization, demonization, and increased polarization. and increased conspiratorial thinking. This is another thing I've really become aware of. So many people I know, very intelligent people, extremely capable people, have fallen prey to conspiratorial thinking. It's a real psychic plague, and I believe it's caused by the same issue. Again, it's this conceptual collapse of the sacred into the profane, and it's a.
Is it the collapse of the sacred into the profane, or is it the collapse of the sacred and the profane expands to cover it?
It's the major challenge facing our civilization, as far as I'm concerned. It's much more crisis than the climate. If we solve this other problem, we'll solve that problem. If we don't solve this other problem, we'll just make it worse, way worse in ways we can hardly imagine. So
if you don't have time to watch both, if you can watch both, they're both fairly good. But again, it's clear where Peterson's at. So he wants to help individuals, not a religious leader, but this rank ordering of values, again, in some ways, modernist. Okay, we're going to rank order these values. How? Well, where are we getting these values from? So anyway, it's good to see him healthy. It's good to see him rested. I know that there's another video coming. There are more interviews coming. We'll see what comes down the pike. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment.